some of which are also represented here below. Reviewing the reform projects, we realized many of them planted seeds of hope that sprouted wonderfully in the areas where they were implemented. Project Impact, or the Project on Instructional Management by Parents, Community, and Teachers, is an example. It was initiated as a practical intervention to address overcrowding in Philippine public schools, as well as the lack of teachers, textbooks, and other learning materials. Its notable features include the supervision of as many as 120 students by one teacher, the active role of parents and other community members, the community rather than school locus of learning, the help extended by other primary students who were trained to teach specific lessons to beginning students, and the option of students to learn by themselves or with a friend, a neighbor, or in small groups once language skills have been developed. At 50% reduction in educational costs, Impact students acquired higher levels of cognitive skills compared to those in regular schools. They also demonstrated better social and communication skills, a greater sense of commitment, and overall leadership potential. The staunch education reform advocate in the National Economic Development Authority, or NEDA, Mr. Nap Imperialo is also here, validated these observations. Project Impact has been relaunched as E-Impact. What puzzled us, though, is why the effective impact technology of the 1970s was not used to address Metro Manila's overcrowded public schools, which is the topic year in and year out. Okay. Unlike Project Impact, BEAM and the Third Elementary Education Project, or TEEP, reflected scale. Together, they implemented school-based management, or SBM, in 40 of the country's 188 divisions, affecting more than 12,000 schools, or as many as a third of Philippine public elementary schools, which we did not realize until we were preparing this paper. That about a third of our elementary schools have already been reached. As practiced in the Philippines, SBM is a framework that integrates school governance with various school-level inputs for achieving equitable access to quality education. This includes changes in perspectives on learning, pedagogy, and community participation. BEAM and TEEP differed in many respects, but they had remarkable outcomes. BEAM aims to improve the access and education quality in 3 regions in Mindanao, including the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. Its underlying learning philosophy assumes the active construction by learners of their own knowledge through interactions with their natural and social environment. BEAM asserts that higher-order thinking skills develop in flexible and cooperative learning and classroom environments, rather than in classrooms where you have a one-way transmission of knowledge to passive learners. This explains BEAM's focus on training in learner-centered management, teaching, and learning materials development. The average scores of sample learners in the BEAM areas increased significantly across subjects through the years, particularly in higher-order thinking skills. With regards to enabling conditions for effective classroom learning, BEAM has established a management training system utilizing appropriate learning systems for regional, division, district, and school managers, an effective teaching training, and a system of producing culturally sensitive learning materials. BEAM has also forged partnerships with teacher education institutions, or TEIs, and the National Educators Academy of the Philippines, or NIAP. In contrast to BEAM's philosophical coherence, TEP was less mindful of its learning philosophy, although its more pragmatic and eclectic thrust incorporated some of BEAM's social constructivist notions. The decentralization objective and research identified determinants of desirable student outcomes rather than specific learning theories guided the formulation of the TEP. Hence, civil works and goods procurement, or the procurement of textbooks, etc., were significant components of its reform program. SBM, or school-based management, which means the schools govern themselves, iterated in TEP. Since the consultant who fleshed out SBM in the ADB report on decentralized basic education management joined TEP subsequently, and that is Maludo Ranila, TEP did not have to invent the wheel. The number of schools that adopted SBM expanded exponentially within 3 years to all the 8,600 schools in 23 TEP divisions. TEP divisions correspond more or less to the provinces. Like BEAM, TEP's SBM operationalization included the formulation of 5-year school improvement plans together with parents, communities, and stakeholders. TEP differed from BEAM, however, because it drilled down SBM cash grants, or what we in the government sector know as MOOE, to schools. At the moment, they're not drilled down to schools. They remain in higher levels, and people in higher levels can say, you need 50 dictionaries, and you will get 50 dictionaries. Now, school, at least in this project, schools could make a decision on what they wanted. And its school heads supervised classroom construction within a 90-day cycle, without any reported anomaly. And that I'd like to stress, without any reported anomaly. The student outcomes in the TEP divisions are very impressive. Although they started out with lower average scores in 2002, they consistently outperformed schools in provinces that were less poor. They also ranked as well, if not better, than schools in non-poor divisions, a performance the TEP schools sustained beyond project completion in 2006. Moreover, systematic targeting of disadvantaged schools also narrowed the gap between monograde and multigrade schools in TEP divisions. There's really a real gap, and this is where the equity issue comes in. But in the TEP divisions, that was narrowed compared to the other divisions. Reflecting on BEAM and TEP, we strongly believe that combining the features of these projects is the fastest way to achieve the BESRA goal of implementing SBM nationwide. BEAM's philosophically coherent educational interventions would have a much higher probability of taking root if TEP's SBM strategy is used to till the soil. This means that in addition to community and LGU participation, we proposed the giving of direct accountability for SBM implementation to division offices and the drilling down of funds to schools. This would prepare systems for the shift in learning paradigms so that BEAM initiatives can grow and spread faster. They can also go at the same time. Okay. What would constrain these initiatives from taking root and rolling down to other parts of the country? Although policy covers for decentralization and pedagogical reforms are now in place, a number of institutional factors constrain the scaling up and implementation of reform. We will cite only 3, and we will cite it at the level of the Department of Education, although this might also apply to other education bureaucracies in our country. 1, dependence on external initiatives. 2, the pilot project mentality that we referred to in a chapter in the Philippine Human Development Report that's forthcoming as education reform in a Petri dish, and the culture of hierarchy and obeisance in DepEd. What is clearly discernible in DepEd's reform activities over the last 20 years is its almost exclusive dependence on foreign-assisted programs that have pilot project components. It seems that reform activities were undertaken only as DepEd moved from one donor-funded project to another. It is important to ask whether this indeed is a question of finance, because project impact has shown that costs can be reduced by as much as 50%. It seems to us, too, that DepEd's manner of undertaking reform is to projectize it, and the department's idea of projectization is to pilot test it based on a quasi-experimental notion of how change can proceed. The pilot test the efficacy of reformist interventions, but always on a limited scale, because quasi-experiments are really limited. Fortunately, BEAM and TEP push the limits of such experiments to cover 1/3 of all elementary schools. Their experiences give credence to the argument that reform efforts are best when large-scale, coordinated, context-sensitive, and sustained over time. Wedged at the margins of DepEd's operations, the projectization of externally induced education reform seems to have prevented the department from directing the reform process. It does not seem to have fully embraced the tasks of processing the lessons of every reform project, drawing their implications, and planning how to scale up ideas that work. Instead, DepEd seems to have simply moved from one project to the next, without really fully connecting the projects to its larger reform agenda. There is nothing wrong with treating the conceptualization and implementation of particular reform projects or interventions as projects. In fact, this might be the way to focus the attention of units within DepEd on ways to achieve particular performance outcomes. Projectization becomes a problem for two reasons. First, when a mission as important as scaling up or sustaining reforms is not undertaken unless you have external prodding. And second, when the bearers of institutional reform in a bureaucracy no longer vigorously exert efforts to sustain reform after project targets have been met. The governance of DepEd is not only highly centralized, it is also extremely hierarchical. For instance, no policy or practice in the lower levels of the hierarchy may change unless there is an explicit DepEd memo from the central office that allows it. An example is the rather ridiculous scenario of schools rejecting much-needed donations from credible donors because of the absence of a DepEd memo. This cultural mindset is undermining DepEd's moves towards decentralization. Indeed, despite the success of SBM in both BEAM and TEP, and the proven capacity of school heads to supervise classroom construction and manage funds, there still prevails a general distrust of school heads and classroom teachers in the field. The hierarchical culture is reinforced by a culture of obeisance that characterizes many bureaucracies in our country, and we're just using DepEd as an example. Teachers, for instance, hardly complain about multiple tasks away from the classroom that include cooking for visits of officials from central or regional offices and organizing their students so they can wave flags when the officials come in. The observation visitations of the higher-ups have actually been described as bitbitations that are fruitful and fishful because they come home with so many goods. Nor would teachers argue on substantive issues. School heads, division superintendents, and regional directors, no matter how outspoken, tend to defer to those above them, even if they are more experienced or knowledgeable on an issue. Such deference can kill initiative. There are hopeful signs, however, that the culture of obeisance is changing with school-based management. Some officials decry the empowerment of school heads, whom they think have become stubborn and arrogant. Why do they say so? Because school heads have begun to answer back. What do I mean by answer back? They now argue their points. The constraints of the transformation of our education landscape go beyond institutional, administrative, and cultural factors. Education reforms will only not transform unless we go back to fundamental questions about what education is and what it is for.